Johnsgard. There's only one A. It used to have two, but my grandfather reduced it to a more American-sounding name. But basically, I'm half Norwegian, and that's what my surname means. It means John's pasture. So my great-great-grandparents were probably born in a pasture. That's the best I can make out. I was born in North Dakota along the Red River, born at Fargo, but grew up first in a tiny town named Christine, now nearly extinct. I drove by it a few weeks ago, and I saw 15 electric lights in the dark, and that must be about all the people who have electric lights. It was a town of about 100 at that time. And so I went to my first 2 grades there. When I was 8, we moved to Wahpeton, a substantially bigger town of about 5,000. And so I did the rest of my grade schooling and high schooling there, and then went on for 2 years to what's called the science school. It was a junior college in Wahpeton. So I spent 20-odd years of my life in North Dakota. From Wahpeton, I went to Fargo and got the last 2 years of my undergraduate degree at North Dakota State, now North Dakota State University. I was back there about a month ago. They gave me a outstanding alumnus award, for which they invited me to the football game, which is the last thing I wanted to do. But anyway, I did most of the other things they wanted. Then on to Washington State College for a master's, and on to Cornell for a PhD, and on to England for postdoc work. So I pretty well covered the country, if not the hemisphere, in getting degrees. I got my job in Lincoln near the end of my second year in England. My fellowship lasted 2 years, and I hadn't heard of any jobs in the U.S. until about April or May of my second year, when I was getting a little worried. But then I heard via my old professor of a job in Lincoln, and I'd never been to Nebraska. Anyway, he said, well, Lincoln's a nice place to look for another job from. And so I said, okay, I'll apply. And they hired me sight unseen. They didn't have enough money to bring me over for an interview. So I came over, never having been in the state or knowing anything about the Cornhuskers. Probably wouldn't have taken the job if I'd known about them. And been here ever since. I fell in love with the state, especially the birds, and Lincoln. Lincoln's one of my favorite towns in the world. So I think it's a very safe and secure town, clean. I walk the streets regularly, and I've never felt in any danger. The winters aren't great, but they're better than North Dakota, which is sort of a relative thing. And the birds are wonderful. We have, in fact, my old professor said it's got a great bird migration. That pretty well sold me. A lot of waterfowl. And he was right. The university has been good to me. I was promoted as fast as one could possibly hope for, a little bit faster. So I was a full professor 7 years after I started as an instructor. That's not possible anymore. And the climate, teaching climate, as I saw it at least, was a comfortable one. I pretty well taught the courses I wanted to teach, and was allowed to write the books I wanted to write. Nobody ever said, don't write that sort of trash.
I'd like to explain to you a little bit about what the Heritage Room is. We are a collection of non-circulating works by and about Nebraska authors, and we are promoted to to preserving these authors. And we maintain a collection of over 8,000 volumes, which represents over 2,700 Nebraska authors, and that's a real rich treasury and real wonderful heritage we should all be very proud of. In an effort to promote these authors, the Heritage Room, in association with the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, sponsors the John H. Ames reading series tonight to bring these authors to a local audience and bring the audience to these authors as well. And the Heritage Room and its information services is supported by an endowment fund which was sponsored and started through the volunteer efforts of the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association in cooperation with the Lincoln City Library Foundation. And we're very grateful for their assistance, because without that we wouldn't be here tonight. And I encourage and welcome all of you to come and visit our collection sometime during our regular public service hours, and you can see many of the rich resources and treasures of our Nebraska authorship that we have here. And tonight I would like to introduce Dr. Paul Johnsgard, a man for which so much can be said, so I won't take a lot of your time tonight because I'll have you come back and read our vertical files that we have all about him, which is great. When I asked him for some information about himself, he sent me 10 pages of vita and a full bibliography, which was just wonderful. And he has achieved many accomplishments, and he's been honored by many, so it would be unfair to mention some and not the others. So I would just like to tell you a couple little interesting tidbits that I had learned about and some of his Nebraska connections that I've come to know. He was born in North Dakota and attended North Dakota State University and received his bachelor's degree there in zoology. And while he was there, he received a scholarship from North Dakota Institute for Regional Studies, which resulted in the initiation of a card file on record of birds of North Dakota, and later was the basis for the publication of a booklet entitled Waterfowl of North Dakota, which was published then in his senior year. And I find this fact particularly poignant because it's from those same humble beginnings of a card file that of Nebraska authors that the Heritage Room grew from. So his long tradition in the history of birds is also similar to our long tradition of collecting information about Nebraska authors. He received a master's degree from Washington State University and a PhD from Cornell University. And in 1961, he was received into the Department of Biological Sciences here at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. During his tenure here at the university, he has published 33 books, and I'm told he has 2 currently in press, and is probably working on many more different ideas currently as we're speaking. He's written both technically and he's written for popular audience as well. And his world surveys of major bird groups has made him the most prolific of all living ornithological writers. And he's considered the world's authority on waterfowl behavior on such groups as grouse and cranes. Of other particular interest here in Nebraska, in 1988, he received the Loren Isley Award for writing in the area of science and humanism, and was featured in a Nebraska public television documentary program called A Passion for Birds, and I'm sure we'll know more about his passion for birds later tonight. He wrote the script for the PBS nature program called Cranes in the Gray Wind, which aired nationally in January of 1990. The Heritage Room is very pleased to have signed copies of just about all of his books. We're checking to make sure we have all of them. If we don't, we will be sure to have all of his copies here. We also have several original manuscripts of his works. We have original sketches that he's done, and we also have 2 carvings of owls that he has done here, and those are in the back of the room there too. You can see there. So we're also very pleased to have him do a John H. Ames reading program for us tonight. So with that, let's welcome Dr. Johnsgard.
Thank you very much, Vicki. I didn't make any special plans as to what I would talk about. Although this is a quote reading program, I guess I'd like as much to tell you about the process of writing books, at least my process, and why I write books and how I write books, as simply show you the final product. I've been writing books for a long time now, about 36 years, and the approach, my sort of physical way of writing books has gradually shifted from an old Underwood portable typewriter to a IBM typewriter to a Selectric to an Apple II computer, which I started in 1982. Which is still running. I had it on today. I have a lot of old files that I haven't been able to convert to a more modern machine, so I still use it occasionally for those. And then more recently a Macintosh where I do my writing now. It hasn't been continuous improvement. Sometimes I've lost whole files in the computer and wondered why I ever left my old IBM. And so there are some upsides and there are some downsides to writing that way, but nonetheless, publishers almost invariably nowadays insist on not only a manuscript, but an associated floppy disk or disks to go with it, so they save a lot of time in typesetting. So you don't have much choice. Old typewritten manuscripts are simply not acceptable anymore, unless probably you're a famous author who refuses to do anything. But John le Carre apparently still writes his manuscripts in longhand. But if you're just an ordinary peon, you have to obey the laws about modern publishing. When I was in England, I was there right after my PhD at Cornell. I spent 2 years there on a fellowship at a place called the Waterfowl Trust, which at that time was the very best collection of waterfowl in the world, waterfowl being ducks, geese, and swans. And it had all but about 20-odd species of the world's waterfowl. This was from 59 to 61. That collection no longer is anything like as good as it used to be, and there's no place in the world that I think matches what the Waterfowl Trust was when I managed to get there on fellowship. So I arrived just at the right time. 10 years earlier, and the collection wouldn't have been as good as it was in 59, and 10 or 15 years later, it again wouldn't have been as good. And I started dreaming about going to the Waterfowl Trust and studying waterfowl when I was just starting graduate school. And it took me then about 10 years to get through graduate school, and hoping that nobody else would go over and do exactly what I wanted to do, namely a comparative behavior. But luckily nobody did, and luckily I got 2 different grants, each good for a year, to go over there. And really it was one of those life-shaping experiences, I guess, in many ways, living in England and seeing a different culture and having literally 7 days a week in which to do nothing but watch birds. It seems unbelievable, and being paid for it, no less. And so my dream was that I could write a book which would summarize all of the information I've learned, plus the available information. And so as soon as I got back, namely after I started work at the University of Nebraska, I submitted that manuscript to Cornell, and they published it as a, quote, Handbook of Waterfowl Behavior. I figured that was I paid my debt, as it were, to ornithology by writing a book, and never really expected to write another one. But while I was there, I actually wrote another manuscript. I thought, gee, it would be nice to write a book that was understandable about waterfowl, but understandable to the layman, the layperson. And so I wrote this thing, but after writing, well, essentially all of it, I decided this is really garbage. I can't imagine anybody wanting to publish it. And so I saved the manuscript, but didn't do anything with it. And brought it with me to Nebraska, of course. Well, when this book came out, Handbook of Waterfowl Behavior, I was a member of the then faculty club, which ate lunch over in a building now occupied by the Wick Center. The building is gone. And Bruce Nickel was then director of the University of Nebraska Press, and I came to know him as a kind of a raconteur. He never really, when we were in his presence, you listened rather than talked, so he didn't know I'd done any writing. But one day, he came in with a copy of the New York Times, I think it was, the book section, waving the thing madly as he approached me. And he said, quote, "God damn it, Jonsgard, what's the big idea?" And I had no idea what he was talking about, but it turned out my book had been reviewed in the New York Times. The reviewer was David Bannerman, one of the really highly respected ornithologists of the day. And anyway, he said, "What's the idea of letting somebody else publish your book? Why didn't you let us publish it?" And I said, well, at that time at least, My attitude was University of Nebraska Press publishes mostly Cather and Western history, and I've not known of any books on birds or even vertebrate zoology they'd ever published. So I said, that's my impression. I didn't think you'd be interested. He said, well, it's my job to decide what I'm interested in. He said, I want you to write a book for us. And I said, well, I don't really have time for that. I've got a heavy teaching load and all of that, trying to set up a research program. I said, I did write another book manuscript while I was in England, but it's no good. And he said, well, that's my job to decide whether it's any good or not. So he said, I want to see it. So he followed me back to my office, and we dug this thing out. And I kept telling him I didn't think it was worth publishing. But anyhow, the next day he called. Back in those days, apparently there weren't outside reviewers, or at least he didn't use them. He said, by all means, I want to publish this thing. And I was still dubious, but I said, well, maybe if we threw in some nice color photographs, it might not be too bad. And so I put together, I don't know, 40 or 50 or 60 color photographs and converted a bunch more from color to black and white, so nearly all the species could be illustrated, and drew some drawings for it and gave it to him. And we called it Waterfowl, Their Biology and Natural History. Almost immediately after publication, won top honors in the 20th annual Chicago Book Clinic, and was named one of the 100 best science books of the year, and got a variety of other citations. It astonished me, frankly, absolutely astonished me. It made me think, geez, writing books is really easy. Anyway, that book went through many printings and remained in print for, I don't know, 25, maybe 30 years or so. It just fairly recently went out of print. I think it was in print longer than almost any of their other hardbacks. And so it made me think that there's a market for books that are written in a fairly readable way. But nonetheless, I continued on writing monographs. This Waterfowl of North America was one of the next ones. That was, I think, written in the early 70s, 69, 70 or so. The first book I wrote, which I thought was a questionable content from an academic standpoint, was my snow goose book. It happened in a quite incredible way. I was asked to come down to Miller and Payne bookstore, they used to have one, and sign some copies of a book which had just come out. And while I was there, the manager said, John Neihart was in last week, and he signed a large number of copies of Black Elk Speaks, and you really ought to buy one. I knew about Neihart, but I'd never read his book. And so I bought it just because I thought, well, this might be fun to have, get an autographed John Neihart. That was on a Saturday morning. So Saturday afternoon, having nothing better to do, I started reading it. And the expression wasn't around then, but it blew my mind. I mean, it literally did. I'm part Indian, not much, but part Indian, and I've always been interested in Indian religion and Indian mythology, Indian lore. And what's powerful about that book to me is the importance of birds as messengers from the Great Spirit, as intermediaries between the Great Spirit and the tribe or the medicine man. And specifically, Black Elk in his book talks about snow geese, which have always been my favorite goose because they were the first wild goose I remember seeing. And I couldn't sleep that night because I'd been reading and working on this large book on the technical aspects of North American waterfowl, how many are killed each year by hunters and how much they're worth economically, sort of terrible stuff. And to read this book and see that the Lakota Sioux, at least, they didn't regard them as huntable things at all. They regarded them as sort of magical birds. in a way, the way I've never shot at a goose, never would. And I thought, my God, I've got to do something about this. I can't just sort of let this rest. So I got up about 2 o'clock in the morning that night and started working on writing. I wrote the prologue to the Snow Goose book. And from that point on, I just worked on it as much as I could all through the spring. Decided I had to get to the Arctic to see snow geese on the breeding ground, which I'd never done. So I wrangled a small grant to go to the Arctic and went there and saw the geese on the breeding ground and was able to complete the book in what I thought was an authoritative way. I showed the manuscript to our secretary, who had retyped some of my earlier manuscripts and who had complained many times that my books were really boring. So I asked her, is this manuscript worth completing, or is it just junk? And the next day she said, it's the best thing you've ever written. Finish it. And by all means, finish it. So that gave me enough confidence to do it. And then I decided I'd submit it to 3 publishers. I didn't want to have more than 3 rejections. And the first 2 did indeed reject it. I picked 3 of the biggest publishers in the business. But then the third one said, within a few weeks, said, yes, we want to do it. We'll publish it, which was, considering I just sort of thrown it in over the transom. That's the way they describe books that are coming from unknown authors without any advance warning. The rate of accepting such manuscripts is well under 1 in 1,000. So I felt quite lucky. And that book took off. It went through several printings, and then, as I say, was translated into Russian and Latvian, and most recently Japanese. What I think of as my best books, namely the Snow Goose book and maybe Dragons and Unicorns, and the little book on sandhill cranes, those of the gray wind, they just sort of materialized. They just came, almost out of nowhere. Literally, the crane book, I'd been thinking it'd be nice to do a popular book on cranes, but I didn't know how to do it. I wanted it to be very simple and to cover the whole North American continent and to cover about 150 or 200 years of American history. It would have been like War and Peace. And that's all seemed impossible. And one day I was sitting out at a lake cottage in Minnesota, staring at the water, and suddenly it just came to me like a light bulb turning on. I know how to do it. I know how to tell this story in 4 segments, 1 for spring, summer, fall, winter, and 4 different parts of the country and 4 different cultures. And so I can do it that way. I can cover 160 years of history. I can cover 4 cultures. I can cover all the parts of the continent from basically southern New Mexico to northern Alaska. And it just all fit together, and within 2 minutes I knew what the story would be, and I ran into our cottage and started scribbling down these combinations. But there was no typewriter there, and I really don't compose well except on a typewriter or computer. And so I had to drive back to Lincoln that Sunday and start working on it on Monday, and I wrote a chapter a day for 4 days. I was due out at our field station in western Nebraska by Saturday, and so I wrote the whole book in 4 days. It's not a very big book, but still it all just sort of flowed out. When my daughter Karen was a senior, she was very actively involved in Dragons and Dungeons, a fantasy game. And she'd occasionally come to me and ask for some information on dragons and show me her so-called reference works. This was 1982. And they were just junk, as far as I was concerned. They were laughable, I thought, as far as possibility of dragons, the way they were described and identified. And I said, this is really garbage, Karen. And I said, what are you going to do this summer by way of a job? And she said, well, I don't need a job. I'm on got a 4-year scholarship for Wesleyan, so I didn't intend to get a job. And I said, well, nonetheless, why don't we write a book together, and it'll give you something to occupy your time. And I said, we can write about dragons, and we can write about all sorts of other mythical creatures. So I sent her down to this library, told her to check out every book the library had on mythical animals, and so she hauled them home. And we thought, well, we'll write a book called The Animals Noah Forgot, something like that. The ones that didn't make it on the ark, as it were, and so no longer exist. So we came up with what came to be an impossibly long list of mythological creatures, many of which were chimeras in the sense they'd be half one thing and half another. And that wasn't any good. So I finally suggested, Karen, let's just limit it to 2 types, sort of one bad type, if you will, and one good type. And we can use the unicorn for a good type and use dragons for a, quote, bad type. And I'll be the dragon and you can be the unicorn. You can write the unicorn section and draw the drawings for unicorns, and I'll write the dragon section. And she thought that was fine. And I went off to the field station again, as I usually do, and wrote the dragon section. And Karen labored along back home trying to write the unicorn section. It was, I guess I overestimated the ease with which she could do it. Anyway, when I got home, she'd gotten into but hadn't completed the unicorn section. So we worked together and completed it together. And I sent it off to St. Martin's Press, the same company that did the Crane book. And originally it was going to be called A Non-Natural History of Dragons and Unicorns. They changed it to A Natural History of Dragons and Unicorns, but accepted it immediately, and was subsequently published and remained in hardback for many years, and still in print in softback. When the hardback version went out of print, I bought the last several hundred copies. So I had sort of a basement full of books. Most people assume authors do have closets and basements full of books. That's not the case. Usually they have 1 or 2. I try to keep 2 of each of my books. But this is one where I still have quite a few. Enough, in fact, that I thought I'd give a few away tonight as sort of door prizes. I thought I'd give one to the oldest person here, if he or she is willing to identify what that is. Anybody over 70? Oh, well, do you care to? Who among you might be the oldest? Oh, 81. I doubt if anybody can beat that. So. Oh, what are you? Oh, well, I guess you win. I'll sign it for you afterwards. And who's the youngest person here? I expect it's Joe, who's somehow managed to grow a little beard, but otherwise. How old are you, Joe? 22. Anybody younger? Oh, you didn't want it anyway. Nobody, I think, who's less than 22 here. I've got one last copy to give away. Who came the farthest? Anybody from out of town? Oh, well, you're disqualified. From where? Beaver Crossing. That must be a good 30, 40 miles, right? Okay, well, that sounds like it. California? But you didn't come here to hear me. I think Beaver Crossing wins. Yeah, they're not signed, so if you want them signed, I'll do it afterwards. Back to more serious business. Anyway, that book was grand for Karen's, from Karen's standpoint. Even though she was on fellowship, she raked in a lot of money on royalties and continues to do so. and impressed her friends and her teachers at Wesleyan. And so it was a nice thing to happen to her. And of all the books I've written, or we've written, but let me say it as I've written, that book has attracted more fan mail. Everything from one woman in her, I think, late 70s at least, wrote to me from British Columbia, I believe, about the book, how much she enjoyed it, and she sort of got into the mood by sending me a photograph of what she said were unicorn footprints, that sort of thing, to children, mostly I would say about 4th or 5th grade, several from little girls who wrote to me as the ultimate authority about whether indeed there are unicorns in this world, sort of a Virginia-like letter, are there really Santa Clauses? And so I've responded to all of those in kind and in a similar way to that Virginia letter. And one or two of them have continued to write to me over the years. And so it's generated some rather nice correspondence. And I like, if people ask me what my favorite book is, I usually say Dragons and Unicorns, because it was so much fun to write. This was done during the Reagan years, Reagan's first year or so in office, and done during the time that Reverend Sullivan had a private school going down in Nebraska City. Do any of you remember that private school? He did it. He was running this private church school without a license. Promptly got arrested and all of that. And so Jerry Falwell, no less, came to Nebraska to lend his support to Reverend Sullivan, and gathered together his teenagers with whom he traveled, I guess, dressed out in red, white, and blue on the steps of the Capitol, whereby they sang religious songs and prayed for the release of Reverend Sullivan. I was downtown that day and saw all the commotion at the Capitol, so I wandered down and listened for a while. And that occurred just about the time Karen and I were talking about a book, and I hadn't really started writing, but that stimulated me to write. So I went back and wrote the section on Saint Gerald, I think I called him, and the dragon, Saint Gerald, and the dragon slayer. There's a fairly big section here on the problems and the ultimate fate of people who go out hunting dragons irresponsibly. And so this whole book, for me at least, not so much for Karen, but for me at least, became a kind of a device for casting satire on our political leaders of the day and our, if you will, religious, not leaders, but I guess figures, and the military. All of these organizations take their hits, although quite a number of these were, according to the editor at least, really not very appropriate, so they threw them out. But I bring you, I am giving to the Heritage Room the first draft of Dragons and Unicorns here, and the second draft, which was the final draft, is just basically the same as the first draft, except it's edited. I didn't make many changes. And some of you might like to come up here after the talk and see some of the drawings for it. This was the sort of logo we came up with, a yin-yang. The point being that obviously we have these two extreme animal types, one representing sweetness and beauty and good and innocence and all of that, and the other sort of iconoclastic aspects of personality, danger, quote, ugliness, if you will. And the point being, because these merge with one another, is that that in order to make a complete world, you have to have both. That's what yin-yang is all about. You can't have day without night, you can't have good without evil, you can't have happiness without sadness. Those are inevitable things, and so there's a good deal of that sort of philosophy in the book. And one of the points being that we need to have dragons, whether you're talking about any number of things, there have to be dragons in this world, just as there, in order that there can be unicorns, if you will. And so the book became metaphorical. Here's another drawing which unfortunately didn't make it into the final. I don't know why they didn't include it. I liked it a lot. Fawns, unicorn fawns jumping over a baby dragon. But they didn't use every drawing we submitted. And this drawing, which I pulled out of my old drawing files today, shows sort of one of the steps of drawing. I started the drawing back here, and I didn't like, I think it was the legs of these unicorns, so I just quit and flipped it over and did a reverse image of the same drawing, which did satisfy me, but apparently didn't satisfy the editors because they didn't use it. But nonetheless, I liked it. This drawing was colored after the fact. It was a black and white drawing and was reduced in size down to less than a dime, so most of the details were gone. Nonetheless, this was, for me at least, a really interesting and fun project, and I'd like to think of some similar topic which would give me as much pleasure as that book did. I've been interested in birds as long as I remember, so ornithology was not hard to get interested in. There was a TV program called A Passion for Birds, and I've had a passion for birds all of my life, and I've had a compulsion to write, and you put a passion and a compulsion together, and that's what you end up with, about 30 some odd books. But there's no living author in biology that I know of who's written anything like that amount, and so my compulsiveness is extreme. I usually work on, well, right now I'm working on 4 books, and I've worked on as many as 8 books simultaneously, which is way too many. Traditionally I illustrated my books with photographs, which I've been a wildlife photographer since I was in high school. I started publishing wildlife photographs when I was in high school. And then especially drawings, and that's all self-taught. I've never had a lesson at all. But I did it mostly, I think, for economic reasons. I couldn't afford to hire an artist, so I decided, well, I better learn how to draw well enough to illustrate books. And so most of my books, one of my books that I'm now working on is a revision of hummingbirds in North America. There are 48 species, I guess, so there's a range map for each of those species, and I drew that. There are anatomical drawings for many of the species. I drew all those. And then there are behavioral drawings and, well, a little of everything. So I like being able to illustrate things in a clear and, I guess, concise way, sometimes fairly difficult sorts of ideas or constructs. I like to be able to try to put them into visual context. I think better than, I don't want to be egotistical about this, but I think better than most I can take a lot of technical stuff, vast amount of technical information, and sort of rework it into readable form and illustrate it, photographs, drawings, and make it accessible to people who don't have access to these books. And I'm not the best storyteller, and I've only done about 3 books which were real stories. But I'm, I think, honestly quite good at what I suggested. Well, I think everybody who writes as a kind of a legacy, if you will, to hopefully remain when they're gone. I think everybody who, except those who write for money, but my books don't make any money to speak of. So I write in the hopes that some of my books will still be around 50 years hence, and people will look at them and read them. I'm probably going to write more and more popular things, probably even some children's books beyond the one I did write, because that's an audience I'd like to reach more effectively. Probably anywhere from 6 to 9 or 10. That's an audience area that I think should be exposed to accurate natural history. I've traveled all over the world, and I might write a few more things about places I've been. I've been to Africa, but I've never really written anything about Africa, and been to the tropics many times. And so I am planning on writing a collection of, not really a memoir, but a collection of previously published articles from natural history and some of the other birding things, interspersed with little essays, some of which have been published in the Lincoln paper. I've used the Lincoln paper as a kind of a sounding board to publish some of my essays. And so that's a little different from what I've previously read. I like changing course rapidly, going from a technical monograph, which is boring as can be, to a very popular thing, or working on the two simultaneously so I can shift back and forth as the spirit moves me. I often do that. Other than Neihardt, and it's really only his Black Elk Speaks that I've read. He didn't. I've got a collection of his poetry and so on, but the contemporary writer who's influenced me, well, there are two really. Aldo Leopold, who wrote Sand County Almanac. I got a copy of that for Christmas in 1949, and it became basically one of my very favorite books immediately. That's a well-known book by a conservationist, ecologist writer. Almost everybody who's studied ecology has read about Aldo Leopold. And so I tried to mold my writing somewhat after his. Very spare writing, very easily understood writing, but still powerful. And then more recently, Annie Dillard, specifically Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Her book, Pilgrim, was reviewed by, in the Washington Post, I think, reviewed by a person who simultaneously, in the same column, reviewed my Little Snow Goose book. And I was honored that I'd be sort of put that close to Annie Dillard, because I'd fallen in love with her Pilgrim book. And the only thing bad about her writing is that I can never write that well. It always makes me think, why do I even write when there are people around who write like Annie Dillard? When I was in high school, I read assiduously a lot of things, but I read Time magazine from about the time I was a freshman, and I thought, Time magazine is a good model. It was concise and accurate and interesting. So for many years, I tried to model my writing after the kind of writing I found in Time. And I think if you're planning on being a writer, you have to really study somebody's work or some kind of writing very, very carefully to see how they do it. You can sort of take it apart and figure out, why did he or she start his story with such a way, and how is it ended, and how's it constructed. So you can't just sit down and decide to write about how I visited my grandchildren or grandparents or whatever. There has to be some kind of internal structure. The first book I wrote, which was based on my postdoctoral work, was what I thought at the time would be the only thing I ever wrote. I mean, I figured that was my one contribution to ornithology, and I thought I'd done my duty after I wrote that book. And it was only later that I thought. It won several awards almost immediately for reasons I don't understand. But anyway, it made me realize, gee, I can write books. It's not that hard. And so I decided to write some more. And then people started asking me to write books for them. The long series for Smithsonian Press, I've done about 6 books for them now. That started with them, with the editor calling me and saying, gee, we'd like to have you write a book for us. And a series with Indiana University Press, 2 or 3 books, same way. They had read something. So when you get asked, at least when I get asked to write a book for a publisher, I figure, well, they'll probably publish it. And so it's a nearly sure thing. But anyway, there's no easy way to writing. I mean, frankly, there really isn't. I think it was a combination of luck and a lot of writing practice, writing love letters to a fiancée over a period of 2 years. A lot of experience in writing letters. The marriage never happened. We broke up. But it was a good writing experience. I also brought with me, not quite my most recent book, but the most recent one that applies to Nebraska is called This Fragile Land, Natural History of the Nebraska Sandhills, and it's one of my more favorite books. I had a great deal of fun writing it. I'd been out to the western part of the Sandhills for 17 years, 17 summers. Finally got to the point where I thought I knew the Sandhills pretty well, and sat down about 2 years ago and wrote the thing in a semester. It took a good part of a semester to write. And Nebraska Press took it on sight unseen. I just called the editor and said, I've got a manuscript on the Sandhills, and the editor said, we want to do it, as I thought they would. And this is sort of halfway between a strictly popular book and a more serious one. There's a lot of references, but I didn't make any direct references in the text. The text reads reference-less, if you will. Let me tell you a couple of the points about this book that you probably, even if you've read it, might not be aware of. Way back when I was an undergraduate, I ran across a book authored by a man by the name of Paul Sears. He was a plant ecologist from Iowa State University. And one of his lines, actually several of his lines, but one of his paragraphs goes like this. He said, the face of the earth is a graveyard, and so it has always been. To earth, each living thing returns when it dies. Those features which it had during its brief day in the sun. The exact wording I've lost, but I love the cadence of that first line, the face of the earth is a graveyard, and the idea of it. And it's sort of been in the back of my mind a long time. So as a kind of a bow to Paul Sears, I decided I'd use a line of that length and that kind of cadence to begin every chapter, so that, for example, chapter 2, the relics of glaciers still haunt us, and chapter 6, most roads in the Sandhills lead nowhere, and everyone is like that. True prairies make excellent cornfields. The soils of Nebraska are foreign. Anyhow, that was kind of fun, coming up with a line which was exactly right in terms of the cadence and length. Let me read a paragraph or so of one of these. This is called Roads and Ranch Trails, and the subtitle is Boots, Burrowing Owls, and Box Turtles. Most roads in the Sandhills lead nowhere, and that's one of their primary attractions. They tend to become more and more indecisive the farther one goes and finally disappear in sandy confusion, often at a fence or a ranch's gate. Thus, traveling on unfamiliar sandhills trails is always a kind of an adventure that frequently has an unknowable ending. The roads are also lonely. As a result, one can drive down the wrong side, if indeed there is a wrong side, for most sandhills roads are only one lane anyway. This may be more desirable for a wildlife photographer because it puts the driver as close to the left edge of the road as possible and brings roadside birds a bit closer for photographing them from the window of the driver's side. One can exploit good photographic opportunities by cradling the camera in the lap and steering with the knees as needed. These are sometimes dangerous, not to say illegal activities on most country roads, but are well within the range of acceptable driving habits in the sandhills. That was one of the chapters I liked a lot in terms of writing. But this is in no sense really a poetic book. It's not written in the form of poetry. The price, chapter 8, the price of existence is dying. That grim realization, perhaps more than anything else, sets humans inexorably apart from all other animals and has generated a bewildering array of often contradictory religions. Other animals seem to be able to live enthusiastically, reproduce exuberantly, and even die with a kind of a grace and ease that we are wholly unable to understand. Life in nature is usually short and has ending and typically has abrupt endings. Even a lucky individual's lifespan may be measured in hours or days rather than years. Well, in any case, that was a slight departure from my usual way of writing books and made it, I think, a little more interesting, at least to me. Let me just read a couple of other short portions from one or two books. Dragons and Unicorns is dedicated to those people who still look for cloven hoof prints in mountain meadows and for smoke clouds rising from the mouths of caves. And the introduction begins, for some centuries now, humans have generally believed that the last dragon died in medieval times, perhaps at the hands of an overzealous knight determined to add a dangerous serpent to his life list of victories over evil, or that the species had become extinct because most pre-flood dragons were excluded from Noah's Ark, owing to their bad breath and tendencies to put things on fire. The unicorn was one of the first animals to be shifted from the Middle Ages list of huntable species to the category of declining and in danger of extinction, thanks to habitat destruction and the selfish human desire for their precious horns. Believe it or not, so-called unicorn horns, which were usually the teeth of a species of Arctic whale, were worth more than their weight in gold, truly, because they were believed to be an antidote to all sorts of poisons. The Pope, one of the popes of medieval times, actually drank everything he had to drink out of a vase made out of a so-called unicorn horn because he was afraid of being poisoned by somebody. And so the unicorn horn was believed to be magical. And that sort of belief in the magical properties of unicorn horns is one of the characteristic features of the sort of European tradition. There were several different origins of the unicorn story, and so there's an Oriental unicorn, which is very, very different from the European unicorn, and an Indian unicorn, which was probably the original source of the European unicorn, and that mythology carried over into Europe during the Crusades, and the original dragon, which was probably a rhinoceros or something like that, gradually became shifted to the fire-breathing monster that we all know about. So I've already perhaps spoken longer than I intended. And the very first time I came to the Heritage Room, it was in a closet. Vicki, do you know where that closet was? It was probably was down on this, maybe the second floor. That was the Heritage collection. It was maybe a few hundred titles, something like that. And I was so impressed by the lady who was operating it that I thought, gee, this is a good place to put some of my things. So I've made sure that the Heritage Room has gotten translations and other rather difficult stuff to get, and have always been very pleased to be associated with the Heritage Room. It makes me feel good to be in here, and so it's really an honor, I think, to be included in the collection of the Heritage Room. I've been interested in birds as long as I remember, so my favorite birds have been big and graceful and often white, and that means swans and snow geese and cranes, especially the white cranes. But I love cranes of any kind. They're so fascinating. They are just, to my mind, incredibly interesting. That's one reason I've stayed in Nebraska, because there's no place else where one can see so many cranes so easily. And I begin almost counting the days until the cranes arrive again in the spring. It's one of the truly religious experiences that I feel every spring when the cranes return. Never gotten tired of watching them or listening to them. They have a lot of the mystique of snow geese, but are more intelligent, at least in my opinion. I've never seen a bird that I thought was so wary and so interesting as the cranes. They've been around a long time, and they've managed to survive very well in the face of all sorts of habitat destruction and hunting. I was very, very sad when they started hunting cranes in the early 1960s. I couldn't imagine people wanting to kill a crane. Couldn't imagine it. In the Orient, they're revered as much as almost anything can be revered. And there's no other place in the world, other than Canada, where civilized people hunt cranes. It's just appalling to me that people would want to shoot anything that wonderful. But about 20,000 cranes are killed, mostly by Texans, which, when you think of it, maybe helps explain it. But anyway, cranes are so magnificent that I can hardly even begin to explain. Anyhow, I appreciate your attention and interest, and I'm very pleased to have you here. Thank you very much.
you.